August 1945. As World War II ended, over 600,000 Japanese soldiers vanished into the frozen wastelands of Siberia, and the world forgot about them. Stalin promised they'd return home within months, but decades later, families in Japan were still waiting at empty train stations, clutching photographs of men who would never step off. What happened in those Soviet labor camps that was so horrific? The true death toll remains hidden even today. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. August 8, 1945. The sun rose over the flat plains of Manchuria like it had every morning before. But this morning would be different. This morning would change everything for hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers camped across northeast China. Private Takeshi Yamamoto sat outside his tent and cleaned his rifle. He was 22 years old. He had been away from home for 3 years. The metal of his gun was warm in his hands. Around him, other soldiers were waking up, making tea, talking in quiet voices. The air smelled like dust and smoke from cooking fires. Takeshi carried a small book in his pocket. Every soldier carried this book. It was called the Senjinkan, the military code. He had read it so many times he knew the words by heart. The book was clear. It said a soldier must never surrender, never. To be captured was the greatest shame. Worse than death. Far worse than death, his father had told him before he left for war. If you are surrounded by the enemy, you know what to do. You fight until you cannot fight. Then you take your own life. You never let them take you alive. Never. His father's face had been hard when he said these words. His mother had looked away, but she did not argue. This was the way. This was an honor dot all around Manchuria, in camps and posts and small villages. 600,000 Japanese soldiers believed the same thing. They wore the same uniform. They carried the same book. They had the same orders burned into their minds. Death before dishonor. Death before capture. They were sons of the empire. They would die as warriors. The emperor was God. Japan would never lose. These were facts like the sun rising, like water flowing downhill. Even now, even with the war going badly, they believed. They had to believe. What else was there? That morning, the ground began to shake. At first, Takeshi thought it was an earthquake. Then he heard the sound. A rumbling like thunder, but it did not stop. It grew louder, louder. Men were shouting now, running, grabbing weapons. Officers were screaming orders. Tanks, thousands of tanks. Soviet tanks were pouring across the border from the north. The Red Army had come. For 3 years, Japan and the Soviet Union had watched each other, but not fought. There was a peace treaty. But treaties are just paper. Paper burns. That morning, Joseph Stalin broke his promise. He had promised American President Roosevelt that the Soviets would enter the war against Japan. Now he kept that promise instead. The Soviet attack was massive. Over 1.5 million soldiers. 5,000 tanks. 5,000 aircraft. They crashed into Manchuria like a wave of steel and fire. The Japanese were not ready. How could they be ready for this? Takeshi fired his rifle at shapes moving in the dust. His hands shook. All around him, men were dying. The tanks kept coming. So many tanks. The noise was so loud he could not hear himself think. His ears rang. Smoke burned his eyes. Some units fought. They fought hard. They fought until their ammunition ran out. Then they charged with bayonets. Then with swords. Then with their hands. This was what the code taught them. This was honor, but the Soviet army was too big. Too strong. Too fast. Within days, Japanese positions were surrounded. Cut off. Trapped. There was nowhere to run. The emperor's soldiers faced a choice they had been trained to never face. Fight and die, or surrender. Takeshi expected to die. He was ready to die. He made his peace with it. When the Soviet soldiers surrounded his unit, he raised his rifle one last time. He would take some of them with him. He would die fighting, but his commander did something unexpected. The old major stood up. He put down his sword. He raised his hands. "We surrender," he said. The words sounded wrong, foreign, impossible. "No," Takeshi whispered. "No, we cannot." But other men were standing too, putting down their weapons, raising their hands. They were exhausted, hungry, out of bullets. The fight was over. Soviet soldiers moved through the group, taking weapons, binding hands with rope. Takeshi felt the rope bite into his wrists. He felt shame burn hotter than any fire. He was a prisoner. He was alive, but he was a prisoner. He had failed his father, failed his emperor, failed everything he was taught to be. They marched for days. Thousands of Japanese soldiers walking in long lines. Soviet guards on horses rode alongside them. Anyone who fell was shot. Anyone who tried to run was shot. They walked through destroyed villages and burned fields. They walked until their feet bled. Then they reached the trains. Long trains with boxcars that stretched farther than Takeshi could see. The cars were made for cargo, not people. Dark inside. No windows. No seats. Just wooden floors and walls. Soviet soldiers shouted and pushed the prisoners forward. 100 men into each car. Then 150. Then 200. Packed so tight they could barely move. Barely breathe. The doors slammed shut. Metal locks clicked into place. Darkness swallowed them. The train lurched forward. It moved north. Always north. Toward Siberia. Toward the unknown. Inside the boxcar, men stood pressed against each other in the dark. Some cried. Some prayed. Some said nothing at all. Takeshi leaned against the wooden wall and felt the train rock beneath him. He did not know where they were going. He did not know what would happen. He only knew one thing with terrible certainty. He would never see home again. The train ride lasted 7 days. 7 days in darkness. 7 days without food. The men drank melted snow that guards passed through cracks in the door. Some men died standing up. There was no room for them to fall. When the train finally stopped, the doors opened. Light flooded in, so bright it hurt. Takeshi stumbled out with the others. His legs barely worked. His eyes could not focus. The cold hit him like a fist. This was Siberia. September in Siberia. Already the temperature was dropping below freezing at night. The wind cut through their thin uniforms like knives. Around them stretched endless forest. Tall dark trees reaching up to gray skies. No villages. No towns, no people. Just wilderness and cold. Soviet officers stood in rows, shouting commands in Russian. The Japanese did not understand the words, but they understood the gestures. The rifle barrels pointing. The dogs straining on leashes. They formed lines and marched. The camp appeared through the trees after an hour of walking. It was not a camp like the military camps Takeshi knew. No neat rows of tents. No flags or parade grounds. This place was different. Worse, it was a labor camp. A prison. Tall wooden fences surrounded the area. Barbed wire ran along the top. Guard towers stood at each corner with searchlights and machine guns. Inside the fence were long wooden buildings. Barracks. They looked old and rotting. Gaps showed between the boards. Wind whistled through the cracks. A Soviet officer spoke through an interpreter. His voice was flat and cold. You will work. You will cut trees. You will build. You will dig. When you work hard, you eat. When you do not work, you do not eat. You will stay here until your government wants you back. Maybe months. Maybe longer. Months, the word hung in the air. Takeshi wanted to believe it. Months meant he might see home again. Might see his mother. His village. The rice fields turned gold in autumn. But something in the officer's eyes said he was lying. Something in the way he smiled. The barracks were crowded with men. 200 men in a space meant for 50. Wooden bunks stood 3 levels high along the walls. No mattresses. Just bare wooden boards. Some men had thin blankets. Most did not. The building had a stove in the center, but no fuel to burn. Not yet. Winter was coming, and there was no heat. That first night, Takeshi lay on hard wood and shivered. The cold seeped up through the boards, through his uniform, into his bones. He had never felt cold like this. In Manchuria, it got cold in winter, but not like this. This was different. This cold was alive, hungry, trying to eat him. The next morning, before sunrise, guards banged on the doors. The men stumbled out into darkness. The temperature had dropped further overnight. Their breath came out in white clouds. Ice covered the ground. Breakfast was served in a large building with long tables. The prisoners lined up with metal bowls. A woman with rough hands and a hard face ladled soup into each bowl. Takeshi looked down at his portion. It was thin, watery. Pieces of cabbage floated in it. A few chunks of potato. A small piece of dark bread on the side. That was all. No rice. Rice was what Japanese people ate. Rice every day, twice a day, 3 times a day. Rice was food. Rice was life. This bread was heavy and sour. The cabbage was bitter. The potato was hard and tasteless. Takeshi's stomach turned, but he was so hungry. He forced himself to eat. Around him, other men stared at their bowls with the same sick look. This was what they would eat now. Every day, cabbage, potatoes, bread, no rice. No fish, no miso soup. No pickled vegetables. Nothing from home. Nothing familiar. Their bodies would forget what real food tasted like. After the meal, the work began. Soviet guards marched them into the forest with axes and saws. Cut trees, the interpreter said. Cut many trees. Fill the quota or no dinner. The trees were huge. Tall pines that had stood for 100 years. The axes were dull. The saws were old. The work was backbreaking. Takeshi swung his axe until his arms screamed. His hands blistered. The blisters broke and bled. He kept swinging. The guards watched from a distance, smoking cigarettes, laughing among themselves. They wore thick coats and fur hats. The prisoners wore the same thin uniforms they had in Manchuria. Some men wrapped rags around their hands, around their feet, around their heads. It did not help much. By midday, 3 men had collapsed. The guards dragged them to the side and left them lying in the snow. Work or die, the interpreter said. Your choice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cold was the worst part. Worse than hunger. Worse than the work. The cold never stopped. Never gave them rest. At night it invaded the barracks. During the day, it followed them into the forest. It crept inside their clothes, inside their skin. Some mornings, men did not wake up. The cold had taken them in their sleep. Days became weeks. Weeks blurred together. The routine never changed. Wake in darkness. Eat watery soup. Work until muscles give out. Eat more soup. Sleep on wooden boards. Wake and do it again. And again. And again. No letters came from home. No messages. No news. The Soviet guards told them nothing. They existed in a void. cut off from the world. I'm from Japan. From their families. Their mothers and fathers did not know where they were. Did not know if they were alive or dead. Takeshi tried to count the days at first. He scratched marks on the wall beside his bunk. But he lost track. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only cold and work and hunger. The forest and the camp and the endless gray sky. Other prisoners whispered at night. They said months. It has been months. When do we go home? But no one answered. No one knew. The Soviet officers smiled their cold smiles and said nothing. Winter was coming. Real winter. Siberian winter. The kind that killed. And they were still here. The first winter killed 1/3 of the men in Takeshi's barracks. They died in their sleep. They died cutting trees. They died standing in line for soup. The cold was a living thing that hunted them. By February, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Takeshi did not know cold could hurt this much. His hands were black at the fingertips. Frostbite. Many men lost fingers. Lost toes, lost ears and noses. The Soviet doctors cut off the dead parts with no medicine for pain. Men screamed. Then they went back to work because work meant food and food meant staying alive one more day. In March, something changed. Soviet officers gathered the prisoners in a large hall. This had never happened before. A man in a clean uniform stood at the front. He spoke Japanese. Perfect Japanese. Better than the other interpreters. Comrades, he said. The word felt strange, wrong. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. The Emperor has spoken on the radio and told your people to lay down their arms. Japan has lost. The room went silent. Completely silent. Takeshi felt his heart stop. Lost? Impossible. Japan could not lose. The Emperor was divine. Protected by the gods. Japan was destined to rule Asia, to create the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This was what they had been taught. This was the truth. Your government lied to you, the officer continued. His voice was calm, patient, like a teacher explaining simple facts to children. They told you the Emperor was a god. He is just a man. They told you Japan was winning. Japan was losing. They sent you to die for nothing. For lies, some men shouted. Called him a liar. But their voices were weak, uncertain. Deep down they wondered. They had seen how the war was going. They had been surrounded and captured. If Japan was winning, why were they here? The officer smiled. We are not your enemies. The Soviet Union wants to help you see the truth. Your real enemies are the men who sent you to war. The generals. The politicians. The Emperor himself. They grew rich while you starved. They lived in palaces while you died in mud. Over the following weeks, the indoctrination sessions continued. Every evening after work, the prisoners sat in the cold hall and listened. The Soviets showed them newspapers, photographs, maps showing Japan's cities burned to ash. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by weapons the prisoners could not imagine. 2 entire cities gone in flashes of light. Takeshi stared at the photographs. Buildings melted. People turned to shadows on walls. If this was real, if this was true, then everything had changed. Everything he believed had been built on sand. They showed films about communism, about workers rising up against their masters, about sharing wealth equally, about a world without emperors or generals or war. The Soviet officer spoke of dignity, of brotherhood, of building a new future together, some men believed. They stood up in the meetings and denounced the emperor, denounced Japan. They said the Soviets were right. They wore red armbands and became leaders in the camp. They got extra food, better barracks, easier work assignments. Other men refused. They sat in silence during the meetings. They would not speak against the emperor, would not betray their country. These men were punished. Less food, harder work, longer hours in the cold. Some disappeared into other camps. Worse camps. No one saw them again. Takeshi did not know what to believe anymore. At night he lay on his wooden bunk and tried to remember why he had come to war. What had he been fighting for? His father told him it was for honor, for the emperor, for Japan's destiny. But what was honor worth now? He was alive, yes, but was this living? Starving in Siberia, cutting trees for men who hated him, forgotten by everyone he loved? The emperor had spoken on the radio. That part was true. Takeshi knew it in his heart. The divine emperor had told Japan to surrender, to accept defeat. So Japan had lost. The war was over. They were prisoners not of a battle, but of history, politics, of things they could not control or understand. One night, an old sergeant named Suzuki spoke quietly to the men around him. They told us we would be home in months. It has been a year. More than a year. The war is over, but we are still here. Why? No one answered. They all knew why. The Soviet Union needed workers, needed slaves. Japan was destroyed, occupied by Americans, powerless. Who would demand the prisoners back? Who would fight for men who had surrendered? Men who had brought shame? We are forgotten, Suzuki said. His voice cracked. Our families think we are dead. Maybe we should be dead. Maybe that would be better. Takeshi closed his eyes. He thought of his mother. She would have received a letter saying he died in battle. Died with honor. She would be proud. She would pray for his spirit at the shrine. But he was not dead. He was here. Alive but not alive. Existing. Breathing. Working. Suffering. Day after day after day. The propaganda kept coming. More meetings. More films. More talk of the evils of imperialism and the glory of communism. Some of it started to make sense. Not because Takeshi believed in communism, but because he could no longer believe in what he had believed before. The emperor was not a god. That much was clear now. Gods did not surrender. Gods did not let their people starve in frozen camps on the other side of the world. Gods did not abandon their soldiers. Japan had lied. About the war. About victory. About everything. The generals had sent millions to die for an empire that crumbled like paper. Takeshi had been willing to die for that lie. Had almost died for it. Would have died believing it was true. Now he knew. Now he saw. And the knowledge was worse than the cold. Worse than hunger. Because what did he have left? If everything he believed was false, what was real? Who was he? Just a man cutting trees in Siberia. A man with no country. No purpose. No hope of going home. The transformation was complete. Not to communism. Not to any new belief. But to emptiness. To the understanding that he had been used. Discarded. Forgotten. He was nothing. The release came without warning. 11 years after the war ended. 11 years in the camps. It was 1956 now, November. The first snow was falling when the guards called out names. Takeshi heard his name. He could barely believe it. They gave him a new uniform. Clean clothes. A small bag with bread and dried fish for the journey. Soviet officers took photographs of the men leaving. Smiled and shook their hands. Go home, they said in broken Japanese. Tell them we treated you well. Takeshi said nothing. Half the men who came to Siberia with him were dead. Buried in frozen ground across dozens of camps. Their families would never know where. Would never find their bones. The Soviets kept no proper records. Or if they did, they would not share them. The train south was different from the train north. This one had seats, windows, heat, food. The prisoners sat in silence and watched Siberia pass by, mile after mile of forest and snow. 11 years of their lives lost in that wilderness. 11 years later, they would never get back. At the border with China, they switched to another train. Then another, then a ship. The journey took weeks. All the while, Takeshi wondered what he would find in Japan. Would anyone be waiting? Did his mother still live? His father? His village? What was left? The ship pulled into the port at Maizuru in December. Takeshi stood on deck and saw Japan for the first time in 14 years. The mountains, the sea, the smell of salt and pine. Home, the word stuck in his throat. Hundreds of people crowded the dock, women holding photographs, old men scanning faces, children who had never met their fathers, signs with names written in careful characters. The crowd surged forward as the prisoners walked down the gangway. Takeshi searched the faces, looking, hoping. There, his sister. Older now, gray in her hair. But his sister. She saw him and her hand flew to her mouth. She pushed through the crowd. They stood facing each other. She was crying. "Mother?" he asked. His voice was rough. He barely recognized it. "Gone," his sister said. 3 years ago. She waited. She never believed you were dead. Even when the army said so, she waited. Something broke inside him. His mother had died waiting, believing he would come home. And he had. But it was too late. Always too late. His father was alive but very old. When Takeshi entered the house, the old man looked up from his seat by the window. He stared for a long moment. Then he turned away, said nothing, would not look at his son. Later, his sister explained, "He is ashamed you surrendered. Everyone knows. The men who came back before were treated badly. Called cowards, traitors. People spit at them in the street. Father feels the shame. He cannot face you." Takeshi understood. The code still lived. Even in defeat, even in ruins, the old beliefs remained. Surrender was dishonor. He had brought shame to the family by staying alive. The Japan he returned to was completely different. American soldiers walked the streets. English signs hung in shop windows. The cities had been rebuilt, but in new ways. Western ways. Young people wore Western clothes and listened to Western music. The emperor was still alive, but he was not a god anymore. Just a man in a palace. A symbol. Nothing more. Takeshi tried to find work. No one would hire him. Former prisoners were suspect. Tainted. The government asked questions. Had he been a communist? Had he denounced Japan? Had he cooperated with the enemy? The men who wore red armbands in the camps, who believed the Soviet propaganda, were watched, investigated, sometimes arrested. He lied, said he had never believed, never cooperated, never spoke against the emperor. It was easy to lie because everyone lied now. The whole country lied about what had happened. About the war. About the camps. About everything. At night, Takeshi could not sleep. He lay in a soft bed in a heated room and thought about Siberia, about the men who died, about the graves no one would visit, about the families who would never know what happened to their sons, their fathers, their brothers. The government said 60,000 Japanese died in Soviet camps. But Takeshi knew that was a lie. He had seen the camps. Dozens of camps, hundreds of camps, thousands of men in each one. The real number was much higher, maybe 100,000, maybe 200,000. The Soviets would never tell the truth. Japan would never demand it. The dead were forgotten. Again, he thought about what the Soviet officer had said. About lies and propaganda. About emperors and generals growing rich while soldiers died. He had not believed it then. Did not want to believe it. But now, looking at Japan, he wondered, who had won the war? Not the soldiers, Not the prisoners, not the families. Someone had won. Someone always wins. But it was never the ones who fought. Years passed. Takeshi is married. I had children. Got a job in a factory. Lived a quiet life. He never spoke about Siberia. Never told his children about the camps. When they asked about the war, he said he had been a soldier. That was all. The rest stayed locked inside. Sometimes he saw other returnees in the street. They recognized each other without speaking. Something in the eyes, the way they moved. They would nod and keep walking. No words needed. What was there to say? In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Files were opened. Lists were published. Names of the dead. Locations of camps. Burial sites. Takeshi read the lists in the newspaper, saw names he remembered. Friends who died that first winter. Men who worked beside him in the forest. Men who simply disappeared one day. His son asked him, "Father, did you know these men?" "Yes," Takeshi said. "I knew them. What were they like?" Takeshi thought for a long time. What were they like? They were young, scared, far from home, trying to survive, just like him, just trying to survive. They were soldiers, he said finally. They did what they were told. They believed what they were taught, and it killed them. That night, Takeshi wrote a letter. He never sent it. Just write it and put it in a drawer. It said, "We were taught that death was honor. We believed it. But honor is not dying for lies. Honor is not freezing in foreign dirt for nothing. Honor is remembering, telling the truth, making sure it never happens again. I survived Siberia, but part of me is still there. Part of me will always be there, in the cold, in the dark, with the ones who never came home." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.